Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reacting to
The Science and Scare Tactics of USA Chlorinated Chicken.
Cock-a-doodle-doo, folks. I'm Donald Trump.
Recently, President Trump griped about Europe's distaste for buying American chicken.
Are you sure that the UK will take American chlorinated chicken? That deal has not been done yet.
We're changing all of that.
And his comments touched a nerve for a lot of people.
Come on, get the dancers back.
That's because for decades, there has been a long-standing and divisive trade spat over chicken that's flared up from time to time. Specifically over the U.S. practice of using
This looks like
chlorine to
turkey.
disinfect its poultry
No,
products.
this is chicken.
Is this chicken?
Fears of chlorinated chicken coming from overseas once again animated debates during Brexit
We're not too keen on that chlorinated chicken.
and continue to grab headlines about the ongoing trade war today. And perhaps it's not all that surprising that the yuck factor of chlorinated chicken has staying power for European consumers. But while EU and UK regulators have made it clear, talks of allowing chlorinated chicken are off the table, is this fear well-founded? Or accurate, for that matter? In short, is this something you actually need to give a cluck about?
Why don't you have a bite and stop judging it?
Yeah, okay, that was bad. Let's go ahead and get started.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, let's see what's the
The
science says.
prospect of the EU and the UK accepting chicken that's been treated with chlorine from the United States has once again ruffled the feathers of both consumers and lawmakers alike. Many Europeans have expressed significant concerns about lowering standards on imported meat as part of any kind of trade deal negotiation with the Trump administration. So what is chlorinated chicken exactly? Well, to tell this story, we need to go back to the 1800s, specifically to the 1820s when chlorine started being used to prevent the decomposition of animal intestines in order to create violin strings. It quickly caught on as a disinfectant, and by the early 1900s, it was everywhere. In breweries to eliminate wild yeasts, in the shellfish industry to wash clams, and in the US military to control black mold growing on potatoes. In 1954, a US scientist published an extensive study on how spray washing poultry carcasses with a chlorine solution could lower bacterial count by up to 80%. In 1975, the country's Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, started issuing licenses for experimental use of chlorinated sprays at commercial chicken processors. Fast forward to today, and in the chicken industry, the use of chlorinated sprays are more commonly referred to as pathogen reduction treatments, or PRTs, to mitigate pathogens like Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter. After the birds are slaughtered and the carcasses
Oh, then I
eviscerated,
need to
they're
know
examined
what
and then
is-
will undergo
what is the rate of the salmonella in the States and
I wonder how then Europe does it if they don't have these treatments, how they prevent that without chlorine. That would be interesting. Yeah, I hope she touches on that. What's the different treatment in Europe?
a quote final washing procedure where these chemicals are applied as a spray
the
or
chicken more plump.
Right, I thought that we would also be talking about hormones, something like, not exactly. I don't know, let's see.
wash on the processing line, or as an addition to the water used to lower the carcass temperature. Once the carcass is removed from that bath, it is then rinsed off with water, and so the exposure to chlorine is relatively minimal. In fact, this entire process only takes a few seconds. And there is clear scientific evidence supported by the International Food Standard Setting Body that PRTs are an effective measure which can be used by the meat industry to further assure the safety of meat. And many countries, such as the United
Thing
States,
is,
Australia,
What's
Japan,
controversial is some people debate whether or not to wash the chicken before you eat it or cook it. This shows you have to wash the chicken.
Canada, New Zealand, and Singapore have approved the use of PRTs on meat. However, noticeably absent from this list is the European Union. Why? Chlorine first divided consumer and political opinion in 1995. The freshly founded EU was still recovering from a litany of embarrassing and deadly food safety scandals. In 1981, 300 people died after toxic olive oil made its way onto supermarket shelves in Spain. In 1988, UK Health Minister Edwina Curie sparked outrage when she claimed that nearly all British eggs contained salmonella, causing a dramatic drop in sales. And later that year came the slaughter of 4.4 million British cattle due to the infamous mad cow disease, which would go on to claim the lives of 156 people. Each time that these events happened, the economic cooperative zone that we know today as the EU faced criticism for its perceived failure to regulate the pesticides, foodborne pathogens, or manufacturing chemicals that were provoking crisis after crisis. So this time, they were resolved to try to do something different and take a more proactive approach when it came to food safety standards. Up until that point, legislation had varied between member states, but in 1995, the EU introduced a new law that placed direct responsibility on all food and drink producers to implement the principle of HACCP, which stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. Developed in the US to help NASA astronauts avoid food poisoning in space, the HACCP required meticulous biological and chemical controls at each stage of production. For the EU agricultural industry, the adoption of the policy pushed up standards across the board, from staff hygiene to the temperature of cattle sheds to how many broiler chickens could be packed
Okay.
into a barn. In short, they wanted to prevent outbreaks from happening rather than curing them once they presented themselves. And so, the use of chlorine rinses of chickens was simply seen as incompatible with the new food philosophy that the EU had come to adopt. Using a chemical rinse was seen as a dangerous shortcut or a cop-out from holistically adopting better farming practices. As such, with a stroke of a pen, the
So
EU
of course
officially
it's gonna
banned
be risky if they bring in US meat because it's gonna compromise their meat.
That's not how I take it. I just
I take it because there's no protection. Well, they followed like safety standards, so overall the environment
it's
there's no
better. Yeah.
ill-born illnesses.
Yeah, but if you take chlorinated chicken, the illness is killed. So
Well, supposedly it's at 80%,
well, okay.
but because what's to say 100? The chlorine doesn't say 100%.
But it's interesting. So what in Europe, like with these safe practices, there's never like any
That's what I'm
disease.
wondering.
That's because that's kind of like, I have no doubt that these practices reduce the amount of issues,
Yeah.
but completely cure it to a point where it doesn't ever happen. I don't know. Let's see.
chlorine washed chicken in 1997 and banished huge volumes of US poultry imports from European dinner plates. But while this move was broadly celebrated by consumers here in the European Union and the United Kingdom, chicken producers abroad quickly called foul. Not the least, as it had also suspiciously coincided with increasing pressure from European farmers to boost the competitiveness of their livestock via tariff incentives and compensatory payments. The anti chlorine edict was then, and really still is largely considered today in the United States, just another example of European protectionism. Before 1997, the US had exported around $58 million worth of poultry to 15 EU countries. But by 2011, that had fallen down to 13 million, the vast bulk of which only passing through Europe on its way to another market. It's estimated that given the growth of demand for chicken over the years since, American poultry farmers now lose out on around 200 to 300 million US dollars of potential exports to the European Union each year. So naturally, I had to ask, is the use of chlorine washes on chicken safe for consumers? Well, interestingly, yeah, probably. But I imagine that's not the answer you wanted to hear from me, so let me explain. For starters, while images of dunking a rotisserie chicken in a jug of chlorine would certainly give anyone nightmares,
Save the neck for me, Clark.
the reality is that the
I
vast
think
majority of
the
chicken
chlorine,
processed
like,
in the
what
United
they put
States
in the pool.
It could be similar chemical. I'm not sure what the chemical is. I don't. I don't really know if it's a different chlorine or not.
actually doesn't use it anymore, and they really haven't for quite some time. According to the National Chicken Council, less than 5% of poultry processing facilities still use chlorine rinses and sprays. Nowadays, the industry mostly uses organic acids to reduce cross-contamination. But even if they did still use chlorine, there actually still is robust consensus between EU and US food safety regulators that the use of antimicrobial washes on chicken is still safe. European authorities have analyzed the use of chemical washes and found they don't pose a risk to human health at the concentrations used in poultry processing. Of the small number of producers who do use chlorine, they will use about a cap full of chlorine per gallon, or 50 parts per million in a water tank that chills the chicken carcasses. To give some perspective to this exposure, according to the EU Commission, an adult consumer would need to eat 5% of their body weight in chlorinated chicken each day for an extended period of time to be at risk of ill health from poultry alone. So for someone of my size, for example, I would need to eat the equivalent of 3 entire rotisserie chickens a
We do
day.
that here.
Hmm?
There's people who do that.
But they're not her size.
Oh, her size.
The people that do that, they probably need to eat 6 or 8 chicken.
And that's a lot.
There was a Costco chicken eating challenge. If you could eat a whole rotisserie chicken.
But we don't know if Costco chicken is treated as chlorine.
Yeah,
She
that's the
said it's
thing.
only 5% of the chicken is treated.
A lot.
What's interesting to me, if it's only 5% of chicken treated with chlorine, why is this an issue? Why don't we just banish the chlorinated chicken and that's it? I don't understand. I really thought it was prevalent, but to see that it's 5% of people of companies do it, and like it's such an issue. Like, are those 5% just so rich that they're deep into politician pockets that I don't understand this. It's so confusing.
But again, the key concern of the EU isn't about the chemical itself, but rather that the use of antimicrobial treatments like chlorine washes compensates for poor hygiene behavior elsewhere in the supply chain. So what this means in practice is that the control of foodborne illnesses actually happen in the live bird and not in the processed meat. That's because microbes, like salmonella for example, typically infect the poultry while it is still alive. And if the bird itself is infected, then you can see horizontal transmission between the chicken and the egg it produces, and subsequently, the rest of the flock. So for example, the grandparent stock, the breeder stock that makes the egg of the chicken that we eventually eat, all of those flocks of chicken are tested regularly for salmonella. If any one of these chickens test positive, farmers have to get rid.
That was not how my understanding is. How do you get salmonella in food?
What was your
I
understanding?
thought, okay, like if you crack open the egg, you should wash your hands immediately because this egg material can have salmonella in it.
Well, if the egg material has salmonella, then you're fucked. Their
I didn't know that.
their
I thought,
job is to prevent
I
that.
thought you have to cook it. Like, that's why there's a certain temperature you have to get it cooked
Oh,
too.
no, but you see people eat raw eggs sometimes.
That-
like-
they say you can get salmonella.
Well,
That's
you
not
you
safe.
could, but you have to trust the entities that they do their job.
Yes.
Yeah, but you could. You're right.
Of the entire flock. With this method, the Europeans have managed to reduce the incidence of salmonella amongst their chickens to just 2%, which is impressive. But
'Cause what
achieving
about
this
cross contamination? They say you should not handle food with raw food with cooked food, the same material.
Well, I think this is just extra precautions. I think the likelihood of anything happen is super low. I think this is just, it's a simple precaution that you can take that doesn't really require much effort, but just, better safe than sorry, that type of thing.
kind of herd immunity takes a lot of time. It's estimated that to get there, it's taken around 20 years. But they were willing to put in the work because Europeans have consistently pushed for some of the toughest food safety standards in the world. As a result, EU processors are only allowed to use cold air and water to decontaminate poultry carcasses in order to preserve the farm-to-fork approach that is fundamental to the European food policies. Now, to be fair, the US vehemently disputes this, saying that the ban is, quote, not based on scientific evidence, end quote, and is essentially just willful protectionism designed to shelter EU poultry producers from more competitive imports. After all, according to one study, US methods produce fresh chicken at 79% of the price equivalent of birds on the European supermarket shelves. And in this economy, those kind of cost savings really do make a difference, and I think they probably have a point there. So I found myself wondering, is the US production of chicken really all that different? Is it really just as dirty as the Europeans make it sound? Each year, billions of chickens, or broilers as they're termed by industry, are raised in industrial production systems in both the EU and the US for the production of meat. In the US specifically, the chicken industry breeds and slaughters about 9.34 billion chickens every single year. That's about 25.5 million birds every single day. About 1 million chickens an hour, in fact. And it's speeding up. As you can see from this chart, the per capita chicken consumption has skyrocketed since the 1970s, when the average person ate about 50 pounds of meat of chickens a year. Today, it's more than 100.
Makes sense because, we see the cow, I guess that's beef, right? The beef is going down. It's because chicken is cheaper. People don't have as much money, so they're eating cheaper meat. You still get the protein. Makes perfect sense.
And health-wise, they always say that you stay away from red meat.
Yeah,
red meat.
there is that promotional of white meat over red meat, yes.
In the EU and the UK, the chicken industry breeds and slaughters about 8.6 billion chickens every single year, slightly less than the United States, but given that the EU and the UK have about 44 million more people than the US, they also consume less chicken per capita. Now, while I very much wish that I could tell you that the chickens raised here in the EU and the UK, generally speaking, live out this wonderfully happy life on a cute little farm out of Charlotte's Web, for the majority of cases, that's not actually accurate. Broiler chickens on both sides of the Atlantic experience crowded indoor confinement and unnatural lighting regimes. Plus, breeding practices are also not exactly nice in either of them. Broiler chickens are selectively bred for rapid growth and are consequently prone to a variety of severe skeletal and metabolic disorders that can cause pain, suffering, and death. The more significant difference between the EU-UK and the United States actually just really comes down to animal welfare and safety regulations. In the US, there is no legislation for the protection of farmed birds, beyond state legislation relating to slaughter. Poultry are explicitly excluded from the 1966 Animal Welfare Act's definition of what constitutes an animal. In contrast, Council Directive 2007-43-EC defines minimum rules for the protection of chickens kept for meat production in the EU. This legislation generally aims to reduce overcrowding by introducing maximum stocking densities. It also lays down other conditions such as lighting, litter, feeding, and ventilation to improve welfare. Now, we need to be fair here, because even though the EU does regulate how dense chicken farms can be, it isn't like EU farms are actually any less dense in practice. In fact, they're pretty on par with one another. However, it is still notable that the EU does have minimum legislative standards on animal welfare for keeping these birds, as well as for transporting them, and standards in place for humanely slaughtering them. And again, while the US also has federal humane slaughter laws, it specifically excludes poultry. Quite frankly, when I was doing the researching for this video, the biggest difference that I could find between US farms and EU farms really just simply came down to the sheer scale of the factory farming operations. According to a report in 2022, 7.2 billion chickens, the vast majority of chickens raised for meat in the US, come from a mega factory farm that raised at least 500,000 chickens per year. In contrast, the average number of broilers per farm per year was a bit more difficult to pin down. The most comprehensive data from Eurostat hasn't been updated since 2013, but it places that average somewhere below 90,000 birds.
Okay,
However,
so
there
we're
is a
less.
huge difference in the average broiler flock size from one country to another. More recent data from Germany places that average number at 27,000 birds per farm per year, for reference. And the size of the flock actually matters a lot. Mega factory farm facilities have exacerbated US avian flu crises over the last decade. Having so many animals in one place means that when a case of bird flu hits one animal, it can quickly spread to hundreds of thousands of others, which also
true.
creates more opportunities for the disease to
Wow.
mutate into something potentially dangerous to humans. For disease control purposes, the USDA requires farms to kill every animal on a farm where a case of bird flu has been detected, setting off a chain of events that can disrupt the food safety supply chain and inflate both
Wow.
egg and chicken prices. And yeah, for my American
I can
viewers
imagine
watching this
for the
video,
farmer to just decide, oh, okay, wow, we found a case. Now we have to eliminate it, all of them.
I can't see where farmers try to pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah.
That's definitely not a good approach.
that is exactly why US egg prices are so high today. But you know, as I was wrapping up the research on this video, I found myself asking, at the end of all of it, is European chicken safer? Well, the answer that I found is that maybe, but we don't really know, and we might not ever know. On the one hand, there was a study conducted by the Adam Smith Institute. Full disclosure, this is not an unbiased neutral study. They argue in favor of allowing PRTs, and they lobby as such. They found that immersing poultry meat in chlorine dioxide solution of the strength used in the United States reduces the prevalence of salmonella from 14% in controls to 2%, the exact same as in the EU. But on the other hand, a 2018 study from the University of Southampton found that chlorine washing was not completely effective in killing pathogens on fresh vegetables, and suggested that chlorinating foods simply just makes those foodborne pathogens undetectable, rather than actually eliminating them. And in my opinion, the biggest difference
Is that possible though?
Mm.
Because then if it's just undetectable, we would be having cases of people having this.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, it doesn't kill, but it's just undetectable. So it goes through the system, people end up eating it, and we have outbreaks. But that doesn't really happen like that. So I don't know.
I usually say, what was the percentage of outbreaks that actually occur overall?
in consumer food safety between the EU, the UK, and the US actually doesn't have anything to do with whether or not we chlorinate or don't chlorinate chicken. In the US, the burden is on the consumer to avoid salmonella, whereas EU and UK regulations call salmonella an adulterant on all poultry products, with a focus more on detecting salmonella before it reaches food service or retail sectors through stringent testing at earlier stages of the supply chain. Shifting the burden of food safety towards the poultry industry makes more sense, in my opinion. Consumers often struggle with basic food safety concepts like
It says, please don't do this. Why?
like the
'Cause
pervasive
you
myth of
also have
washing
to,
chicken
you
in the sink.
can,
Please don't
you're
do.
gonna, you have to
Wait.
wash the sink after.
Hold on.
Towards the poultry industry makes more sense, in my opinion. Consumers often struggle with basic food safety concepts like the pervasive myth of washing chicken in the sink. Please don't do that. Regardless of where you live, just observe good hygiene practices and make sure to cook your chicken thoroughly. But honestly, as an American, this is still a really fascinating topic for me to do a deep dive into because from what I really have experienced, this discussion of chlorine chicken is really hyped up here in the European Union and the UK, but it isn't really something that I have ever really heard Americans discuss at large. It just doesn't really seem to be something they care all that much about. Since the original 1997 decision, chlorine chicken has become much more than just chlorine and chicken. To the Europeans, the ban symbolizes a fundamental difference of opinion on how governments should regulate food safety. Light government versus tough government, soft intervention versus hard intervention, but it also symbolizes political and social identities. Chlorinated chicken has once again become the boogeyman in the shopping basket. And the concerns that we hear today in Europe about US chicken or beef imports are ultimately tied to wider fears about negotiating with Trump's America, about the sphere of American influence, and protecting consumers against the influence of megacorporations that hold big business accountable. Something that objectively, whether you're on the right or the left, we can pretty much all agree that the US hasn't been really good about doing. The US farming lobby has routinely pinned its hopes on Trump to push for increased poultry imports as part of any trade deal. The sector threw its weight and its pocketbook firmly behind Trump in the 2016 presidential election, and once more again in 2024, hoping that he'll return the favor. In 2024, donations to the Republican campaign from the egg and poultry sector were 4.5 million US dollars compared to just 224,000 to Democrats. That's 95% of donations to the Republican cause. The overwhelming majority of this money, 4.2 million, came from a single company, the Mount Air Corporation, the fourth largest chicken company in the United States. Like it or not, everything is political, and the fears that surround chlorinated chicken, whether you think they're accurate or misplaced, really is no exception. At the end of the day, I think a lot of the concerns that happen here in Europe around chlorinated chicken really
Tyson.
are so much more than just about what consumers eat, but also about just generally fears that I think consumers here
Pepper's fat,
have as to
not
whether or
pepper's
not the
fat.
governments are going to continue working for them.
Yeah.
And chicken in this regard is kind of seen as a litmus
remember
test,
the logo
as
in
whether or
blue.
not the European governments will stand up to the American government and continue to protect its consumers and its farming businesses against imports from other countries. And also, I think it probably has a lot more to do too with whether or not the governments will continue to uphold their values on a much more broader set of issues. But I would really love to hear your thoughts on this topic.
The important question is the taste different.
Interesting video. So the chlorinated chicken is not really that bad of a thing, it seems
And
like.
it's highly unlikely you have the chlorinated chicken. You
Right,
just probably have
that's
the one that's
also
organically washed.
yeah, it seems like the chlorinated chicken is not that popular. Does seem to be this is more a political issue in Europe to kind of not, as she said, to not allow
Yeah.
American meat. I think just the European farmers lobby against this, so they don't invite American competition. So they kind of use this as a kind of excuse, scapegoat.
Yeah.
But an interesting video. This I had I had no knowledge of this before, so I
Now
learned
they
a
have to
lot.
talk about the hormones
Right, the hormones, like we know, okay, that's a more interesting, and
to
how,
make a bigger chicken.
yeah, how that affects human body as consumed. That is interesting to
Yeah.
see. But I guess it's good to know that chlorinated chicken is not really harmful to us, so that's good.
Can I see the comments?
Mhm. One of the main questions remains: why should I prefer poultry that has to be shipped thousands of miles if it and is already quite old over EU raised chicken that only takes minimal time to reach? Well, I think this is this very simple answer. The shipped poultry is cheaper, so I think you don't have to prefer, but I feel people should have an option. If they can't afford the European meat, they could buy cheaper American meat. I think that's, if you can afford the European meat, go by all means buy the European meat, but I believe it's about options.
Yes.
And if the price is cheaper, so now people that couldn't afford eat chicken before, now they can eat chicken. I think that's a good thing. And it doesn't affect your ability to eat European chicken. I'm sure then European packaging is going to be like, oh, made in Europe, grown in Europe, and you can buy that. But it's all about the freedom to choose which chicken you want to have. It's not the chlorine itself that's the fact that you have to use it. While the direct health effects of fluorine are debatable, the main concern is that U.S. food and farming standards are so bad that chemical bans for meats become necessary.
I just wondered the honesty for farmers overall.
But I like her video because I can take her that she's being honest now, because
Yeah, I think it's fair.
she's kind of makes like pro. In the past, we reacted to her. It was pro-European videos, like more like America bad, Europe good type of videos. But she kept it honest. She wasn't like, "Oh, European chicken is better." She kept it basically the same thing. So, I look at her a little differently now that I know she can be unbiased.
Okay. Guys, of course, let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join the Discord. And as always, share as much kindness as possible.